Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Wanted to say that last Lord's Day and was not able, but I want to thank the two brothers in Christ who preached in my place the last two Lord's Days. I had originally planned on preaching both of them, but my daughter in Minnesota wanted me to stay over a couple of days extra, and I was happy to do that and spend a little extra time with the grandkids over the holidays. Thank you to Jack for preaching here the 25th of December. And thank you to Joseph for preaching kind of on the spur of the moment last Lord's Day. I did give him a couple of days' notice that I'm not feeling well. So can you be on standby? But it's good to see everybody back. Still have people that are out of town for various reasons, but we have a lot of folks back with us from all over the country and all over the world, for that matter, and have a good number of visitors with us to take the place of those of our own number who are out of town today. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Our New Year teaching theme, if you haven't heard yet, certainly we would continue to announce it for a few weeks, is a tour of the New Testament. And we hope to read together as a congregation of God's people 5 chapters a week, 260 chapters per year. Read the entire New Testament through this year at the rate of 5 chapters a week, which is minimal reading. You could sit down in one day and do that in a matter of minutes. Read all 5 chapters if you like, or read just a chapter a day, 5 days of the week. And many of our sermons and most of our classes will be correlated in some way, shape, or form with these readings. And took me a long time to kind of figure out a New Testament reading program that would fit what we had in mind for the classes. And so, but we have that orange sheet in the back of the auditorium. If you pick one up, you can follow along with us and read the entire New Testament with us this year and be on schedule. Mark 1 was one of the chapters that many of us read this last week. And I want to zero in on one paragraph, maybe reemphasize what you did in the adult or the high school class this morning, and just look at that one paragraph just a little bit more closely. I'd like to start with verse 21, Mark chapter 1 and verse 21. And so if you have a New Testament handy, you can read it with me or just listen if you like. Mark chapter 1, 21. We'll read all the way down through verse 39, 21 through 39. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I might preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. I've taught this before, but I'm going to teach it again because I want you to really register this point. At least 3 times in the 2nd century church, there are prominent Christians who allude to the origin of the Gospel of Mark. And they tell us, essentially, in no uncertain terms, yes, this is the Gospel according to Mark, but if you go one step back beyond that, it's Peter's personal remembrances and personal preachings concerning all that Jesus had done and taught. This is everything Peter preached as he went about throughout the Roman Empire in his preaching, and Mark recorded it at the very tail end of Peter's life. You have, for example, Papias in the middle of the 2nd century said Mark wrote down accurately the things said and done by the Lord as taught by Peter, and to omit nothing. That's all significant. And we can look at the entire context of that statement, but every word there is important. You have, toward the end of the 2nd century, the second half of the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria saying that Mark accompanied Peter and remembered all that Peter had said to write down the things related by him. And then you have Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, speaking of Peter's memoirs that reported his name change from Simon to Peter, and where we actually read about that name change from Simon to Peter is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3 and verse 16. But Justin Martyr speaks of that as reflective of Peter's memoirs. And you see that in the Gospel of Mark. So you have 3 pieces of evidence in the 2nd century that speak to the issue that Mark is recording and writing down what the Apostle Peter had commonly taught in church after church, in community after community, from the time that Jesus died, was buried, and arose to the time of his impending death. And Mark writes this down for all posterity, and it goes down in history as the Gospel of Mark. But I think it will revolutionize your reading to think Peter's eyewitness testimony as you're reading these paragraphs as you go through the Gospel of Mark among the other Gospels. You have Peter's perspective continually. There are incidents in Mark in which Peter omits things that might make him look good, and he maximizes things that make him look bad because they had made an indelible impression on his mind. "Get behind me, Satan. You're not minding the things of God, but the things of man," chapter 8 and verse 33. You have Peter entering in as eyewitness number 1 in chapter 1, and you have Peter in chapter 16 as an eyewitness, kind of a bookmark effect. You have a we thou transition, a we they transition rather, in chapter 1. You have in verses 16 through 20, Jesus calls the first disciples, Simon, Andrew his brother, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Immediately he calls them, immediately they follow him. They all go into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he enters the synagogue and is teaching. At once his fame spreads everywhere. Verse 29, immediately he leaves the synagogue and enters the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now it's interesting, in Matthew's account, it says he entered into Peter's house. In Luke's account, it says he entered into Simon's house. But the way that Mark words this is reflective of indirect discourse that goes back a link to the direct discourse that Peter would have reported. This is awkward. You could say, well, these 5 men left the synagogue and entered into the house of Peter and Andrew, as the case may be. But to word it this way, he left the synagogue and entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John, as if James and John are kind of tagging along. But the focal point, this is the house of Simon and Andrew. And if you were to read that back a link, you could just hear Peter saying he left the synagogue and he went into our house with James and John. That makes a whole lot more sense than the way that it's worded in the indirect discourse. But it makes a lot of sense if you read it back into Peter's personal testimony, the way that it is worded. And there are all kinds of instances like that throughout the Gospel of Mark. You have 2 rooster crows. You only have 1 rooster crow in which Peter denies the Lord in the other Gospel accounts, but you have a second rooster crow that is specifically mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. And there's one person on the face of the earth who would have remembered that rooster crow the rest of his life. It would have been Peter. And so he adds a significant detail there that the others kind of gloss over in summarizing the event. We could give many other examples of that. You also have internal clues. You have graphic touches. Jesus is asleep on a pillow in the boat. He's throwing off a cloak and jumping up. You have no leisure to eat. The mention of that, chapter 6 and verse 31. You have Jesus looking up to heaven and sighing, chapter 7, verse 34. You have Jesus looking around him in a synagogue with anger and sorrow, chapter 3, verse 5. You have Jesus looking and loving this rich young ruler and telling him what he needs to hear rather than what he wants to hear. You have him looking around with amazement and fear. You have being filled with great fear, chapter 4 and verse 41. A lot of personal gut emotions that are on the table here by the apostle who was theatrical in his emotional composure above all the other apostles, perhaps. You have a number of Aramaic expressions remembered, Talitha cum. You have Ephrathah, Abba, Father, and so on, as if you go all the way back to Jesus speaking the Jewish Aramaic or the original Hebrew. You have amazement and astonishment. You have in verse 27 people who are just amazed at the authority with which Jesus teaches and performs miracles in the synagogue. In verse 33, the whole city gathered together at the door. In verse 45, you have Jesus going out, and you have or the leper going out, beginning to talk freely about his healing and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was in desolate places. People were coming to him from every quarter. You have chapter 2 and verse 12. He heals a paralytic, and they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. And chapter 5 and verse 42, you have everyone immediately overcome with amazement. You have a "we were there" vivid description of people's reactions. It's like a huge event, and you have a news reporter, and then you have people interviewed. Well, what were you thinking when all this was happening? And that's how Mark feels. because there's eyewitness testimony and the imprint of eyewitness testimony everywhere that you turn. And you have, of course, Peter's impulsive mouth. That is going to make the record. I have this brilliant idea. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And interestingly enough, in chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, verse 6 says, he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Again, that's unique to Mark's account. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Why would you have Peter's unique perspective that's not found in Matthew's account, Luke's account, John's account? It's because Peter has his fingerprints all over them. You also have personal signatures in terms of the young man Mark. Usually the traditional view of this is Mark, even though he's not named. A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Usually thought to be a very young John Mark. In Acts 12:12, Peter would be released from prison in the Acts account of the early church. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. That would be the Mark who wrote this later on. So Peter knew Mary, his mother, from way back, from the very beginnings of Christianity, if not before. And so he knew Mark from the time that Mark was still in the home of his mother, Mary. And then later on, when Peter writes 1 Peter chapter 5, Mark is with him. She who is at Babylon, which is a cryptic name for Rome, usually thought to be so. Likewise in the book of Revelation. So they're in Rome, and who is likewise chosen sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. 2 things to note there. Mark is with Peter in Rome. The Gospel of Mark is usually associated with Rome. You have Simon of Cyrene, who's compelled to bear the cross of Jesus. He's the father of Alexander and Rufus, and Paul alludes to one of those 2 sons along with their mother in Romans chapter 16 as belonging to the community of Christians in Rome. The Gospel of Mark is full of Latin expressions and Latin explanations. It's the most Latin, the most Roman of the 4 Gospels, and is thought to have been written in connection with the very place where Peter was eventually executed, Rome. And Mark was with Peter in Rome, even when 1 Peter was written, and Peter calls Mark my son. Not a literal son, but kind of an adopted son, just as Timothy was a son to Paul. So putting all of that together, the external evidence matches the internal evidence, and there's a whole lot more that we could say. I don't want to develop it any more, but the point is that when we read what we read in chapter 1, and we take all of this and we apply it to what we read in chapter 1, Jesus is teaching in a synagogue. He cast out an unclean spirit. Everybody in the synagogue is amazed. And then he leaves the synagogue and he walks a few steps to somebody's house. Now, this is the really interesting thing. Archaeologists have found what they think is Peter's house. And you could go there if you go to Capernaum, and it would have looked something like that. And it's a stone's throw from the synagogue. So imagine Jesus leaving the synagogue, walking just a minute or two, and arriving at the house of Simon and Andrew. House that looked like that, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And what we know from putting these 4 accounts together, we know from Matthew's account, for example, in Matthew 4 and verse 13, that Jesus left Nazareth and he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea. He lived in Capernaum. And yet we also know from his own statement in Luke 9:58, he says, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Jesus didn't buy a home in Capernaum. I don't think Jesus rented a home in Capernaum. Jesus stayed at someone's home in Capernaum. And I would suggest to you that that home was the home of Simon and Andrew. There were events that occurred there, two key events that occurred there. And we've just read one. And you probably in the adult class read about the other one today. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law occurs at Peter's house of Simon and Andrew. The healing of the paralyzed man whose friends lowered him from the roof is thought to have occurred in Peter's house as well. And the interesting thing about this is that Mark 2 says that when he returned to Capernaum after some days, he had gone preaching elsewhere throughout all the towns of Galilee. They come back to Capernaum. It was reported that he was at home. Whose home? I would suggest to you that this is Peter's home. Now go back with me and read several verses together with me to get the context here. In chapter 1 and verse 29, and immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. So they're in the home of Simon and Andrew as Peter's mother-in-law is healed. Jesus heals her. And then verse 33 says, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. Whose door would that be? The context hasn't changed. It's the door of the home of Peter and Andrew. And the whole town, the whole city is gathered together at the door. So right off the bat, we know something about the goings on here. We have a home in our neighborhood, and I won't specify any more than that. But we have a home in our neighborhood where we have a lot of people that come and go from this home. And Andrea and I are constantly trying to figure out, okay, who lives there? Is that one big, huge family, or is it a halfway house, or is it a lot of cousins, or is it a lot of, and it's, it's people who are a little rough around the edges, probably more so than most other homes in that neighborhood. And there are a lot of cars parked on the street. And but we're constantly wondering who actually lives under that roof. But I want to tell you something. Peter's house probably had that kind of reputation in Capernaum because you have Peter living there, you have Andrew living there, you have a mother-in-law living there, you probably have a wife living there, maybe a couple of wives living there, maybe some kids living there, maybe some extended relatives living there, and here you have Jesus living there in all probability. And I could just imagine what the neighbors were thinking when the whole city was gathered together at the door. Imagine someone across the street thinking, okay, what in the world is going on now? The whole town is there. Everyone's talking about what goes on in Peter's house. And then verse 35, rising early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed. The context hasn't changed. From where does he depart? Probably from Peter's home. He goes out to a desolate place, and there he prays. And note verse 36, and Simon and those who were with him searched for him. How would they know he was gone? It's because he was gone from where he was staying, in all likelihood, which was Peter's house, and Peter leads the search party to go search for Jesus. And eventually they find him and say, everyone is looking for you. And then you have 36 and 37, Jesus repelling that idea. Let us go on to preach to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. And so all of it, Galilee is evangelized, not just Capernaum on the seacoast. And then, after healing a leper, gets a lot of notice at the end of chapter 1. Then you read chapter 2. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Whose home? I would suggest to you it's the same home that's been prominent in the context throughout. This is Peter's home, where Jesus is staying. And then you have a house full of people so that no one could barge in, and you have 4 people bearing a paralytic, a paralyzed man. They can't get in, and so they get up on the roof and they cut a hole through the roof and let this paralyzed man down. And I just wonder what the neighbors were thinking then. Here we go again. And Jesus says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And you have all this grumbling among religious scholars, and he says, in order that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to the paralytic, rise, take up your bed, and walk. And immediately he does just that. And again, verse 12 says, he rose and immediately picked up his bed, went out before them all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. And eyewitness number 1 is right there, mentally recording all of this. That's the context. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and Jesus leave the synagogue. They return to the house of Peter, chapter 1, verse 21. Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever. Immediately they tell him about her, and he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. 3 or 4 simple points, and then the lesson is yours. Number 1, she began to serve them. When I first came across that and thought about this years ago, when I was about Reagan's age, it struck me as odd that they would put her to work. She's been laid out with a fever. But immediately she rises and she serves. There's a lesson there. We are saved in order to serve. We were designed to serve. And the one that has put us in that position himself paves the way. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. So why should it be out of the ordinary in any way that Peter's mother-in-law is conferred the great honor of serving Jesus and serving these honored guests and family, and being well enough and feeling well enough to do what she loved to do, to serve? None of us should begrudge opportunities to serve. We should welcome them. And if we have the time, opportunity, health, and strength to do it, then we should be thankful that God has given us those opportunities. So far from being out of the ordinary or strange, or no, you need to just lie down and rest and let us serve you. No, this was an honor for Jesus, for her, for him to lift her up, to put her back on her feet, and allow her to go immediately to work. It's an honor for us, too, to be able to use the talents and the abilities, the opportunities, the gifts that God has given us to give back something of the rich heritage that He's given to us. And if you have that opportunity, be thankful to God that you have the wherewithal to do it. Secondly, the word got out. This is the first miracle we read about after the healing of the man with the unclean spirit in the synagogue. And the whole town spreads the news. And that evening, verse 32, at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick, oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. Again, presumably at the door of the home of Peter. And he healed many with sick who were sick with various diseases, cast out the demons, and they would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And then the next morning, he gets away from all of this hustle and bustle and the fervor and the crowds and the multitudes and just to be alone. Just to be alone with God. And I don't know if you have a particular place. You ought to think about that. Maybe we live in an area of hustle and bustle and crowds and demands of people all around us. But it's good just to get away from it all, get away from your cell phone, get away from all communication devices, and just go alone to be with God alone. You and God, to be able to pray to God. And that's what Jesus does. He gets away from all of the people here very early in the morning and pours out his heart to God in prayer. And all of a sudden, everybody is looking for him. And Peter's leading their search and hunt party. And they search for him. And find him. Everyone is looking for you, which is our next point. Everyone is looking for you. The implication being that everyone wants to claim your attention and to set an agenda here and to ask you to do a favor for them or whatever it may be, but everyone wants a piece of you. And there will always be people who bring their agendas and their demands on Jesus and try to superimpose those onto God's agenda. And Jesus would have none of it. I haven't come to spend all of my time and years on end at Capernaum. I've got work to do throughout all of Galilee, and that's what I intend to do, even if it means temporarily leaving Capernaum behind. And that's exactly what he does. But saved in order to serve. That's the prominent idea that I want you to come away with here. Here's Peter's mother-in-law, and she is healed in order to serve. In Matthew 25, Jesus teaches, beginning with verse 37, then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or feed you or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of these least of my brothers, you did it to me. So read the Bible, see what surprises are hidden in plain sight, ponder carefully. And as you read the Gospel of Mark, I would suggest to you to read this in terms of Peter's eyewitness testimony on every single page. I think it will open up vistas to you. 2023, I intended to preach this lesson last Lord's Day, was not able to do it. But if you haven't determined to do so yet, read the New Testament with us this year. Make a resolute determination to do that with us. This is minimal demands on your time, and I think it will pay huge benefits to your personal spiritual life. Make God's agenda your agenda. Don't try to superimpose on the Lord some agenda outside of his agenda, but make his agenda your agenda. 3, find a place of service. You are saved in order to serve. Realize that ministry is not something for a special class of Christians who have a capital M minister behind their name. Ministry is for all Christians. We all have something that the Lord has for us to do. And if you've never obeyed the gospel, do it now. The whole purpose of Jesus coming was not to heal people left and right of physical infirmities, but to heal their spiritual infirmities. Son, your sins are forgiven, is what he said to the paralytic. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but if that man had never been paralyzed, would he have ever been brought to Jesus to have his sins forgiven? He might have looked at his paralysis as a blessing. That's something to think about. In the bigger scheme of things, son, your sins are forgiven. And when you're baptized into Christ, you can imagine Jesus saying, son or daughter, your sins are now forgiven. What a great blessing that would be. Think about it as together we stand and sing the song of invitation.